The lawyer didn't even look me in the eyes when he handed me the paper. His fingers were cold, impersonal, like he was passing me a grocery receipt instead of the document that would reshape my understanding of who I was in my father's world. "You're not listed," he said flatly, his voice carrying the weight of finality that lawyers seem to perfect in law school. I sat there in that sterile conference room, surrounded by half-siblings who had already begun to smirk, before the words fully left his mouth. They exchanged glances, quick, satisfied looks that spoke of a quiet, lifelong war they believed they had finally won. Sarah adjusted her designer purse with deliberate satisfaction. Michael leaned back in his chair like he was settling into a throne he'd always known would be his. Even little Emma, barely 22, wore the smugness of someone who had learned early that security comes from being on the right side of family politics. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching, especially if you've ever felt invisible in your own family's story. They whispered among themselves, their voices creating a low hum of conspiracy that filled the space where my name should have been called. No one protested. Not even my stepmother, whose voice once called me sweetheart after the wedding, back when she still needed me to help bridge the gap between her new life and my father's old one. That voice had hardened over the years, growing colder with each holiday where I became more background noise than family member. I wasn't surprised. Not really. Ever since Dad remarried when I was 19, I had become a footnote in the family narrative. Less present at birthdays, more forgotten in Christmas card photos, gradually edited out of the story they were telling, themselves about who belonged. My stepmother had a way of planning gatherings just slightly too small for everyone, organizing trips with just enough seats for her children, creating 1,000 small moments where the message was clear. You're extra. My half-siblings had learned this dance early. They were polite enough. In that distant way you might be polite to a neighbor you don't particularly like, but have to see occasionally. They called me by name, remembered to ask about my job sometimes, but there was always this invisible line, drawn around their unit. Mom, Michael, Sarah, Emma, and I existed somewhere in the periphery, acknowledged but never quite included. What broke me wasn't the money. Money had never been the language my father and I spoke together anyway. What shattered something deep inside my chest was the silence when my name wasn't called. The easy, seamless way they moved forward with the reading, like I had never existed, at all. The way no one seemed to question why the daughter who had helped care for him during his final illness was absent from the list that now dictated his final wishes. I had been there after all. I was the one who sat beside his hospital bed during those long nights when the stroke left him confused and frightened. I changed his IV line when the nurses were too busy, held his hand when he woke up not remembering where he was. I was the one who researched his medications, who advocated for better pain management, who slept in that terrible hospital chair because he seemed calmer when someone familiar was nearby. The others visited, of course. They came with flowers and get-well cards, staying for polite intervals before returning to their busy lives. But I was the one who rearranged my work schedule, who learned to read his vital signs, who noticed when his breathing changed or when his color looked off. I was the one who held his hand during the procedures, who translated medical jargon for him, who helped him practice his speech therapy exercises even when he grew frustrated and wanted to give up. And now, sitting in that conference room, it was as if none of that had mattered. As if those months of caregiving, those years of trying to maintain our relationship despite the growing distance, those decades of being his daughter had been erased by legal documents and family politics I had never fully understood. The lawyer continued reading, his voice a monotonous drone listing assets and beneficiaries. The house on Maple Street, where I had spent my childhood summers learning to garden alongside my father, went to Sarah. The vintage car he had lovingly restored, the one he had promised to teach me to drive when I was old enough, went to Michael. His investment portfolio, the one he had mentioned wanting to use for his grandchildren's education, was divided among my stepmother and her children. I listened to my childhood being distributed like inventory, each memory attached to an object, now legally belonging to people who had never shared those moments with him. The workshop where he taught me to use tools, where we built that terrible birdhouse that still hung crooked in the backyard, that went to Michael, who had never shown the slightest interest in woodworking. The piano where I had played him songs, during his recovery, where we had shared quiet moments of music when words were too difficult. That was designated for Emma, who had quit lessons after 2 months. My stepmother sat perfectly still throughout the reading, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. But I caught the slight upturn at the corner of her mouth when the lawyer mentioned the life insurance policy. I saw the way she glanced, at her children, a look that seemed to say, "We did it. We made it through. We're secure now." I went home that day feeling like I was floating, disconnected from my own body. My apartment, small, cramped, furnished with pieces I had collected, over years of saving and searching thrift stores, felt like the only place I still existed. Everything there was mine, because I had worked for it, chosen it, earned it. No one could take it away or decide I didn't deserve it. I sat on my secondhand couch and tried to make sense of what had just happened. How does a daughter disappear? From her father's will? How do you go from being someone's child to being a stranger in one legal document? I kept replaying the lawyer's words. "You're not listed." As if I had never been listed anywhere, as if my birth certificate and childhood, photos and decades of relationship were just figments of my imagination. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up and walking around my apartment, touching things that proved I existed. My diploma on the wall, photos of me and my father from better times, the coffee mug he had given me for my birthday years ago with "World's Best Daughter" printed in fading letters. I held that mug and cried harder than I had cried since his funeral, because it felt like he had died all over again, taking our relationship with him. I stayed up until dawn, rereading old letters he had sent me when I was in college. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, each word chosen with the precision of someone who didn't write letters often, but wanted to get it right. "You're my anchor," one read, written during my sophomore year when I was struggling with organic chemistry and considering dropping out of pre-med. "Even when everything else is chaos, thinking about you keeps me steady." Another letter, from my senior year. "I don't say it enough, but I'm proud of you. Watching you work so hard, seeing you push through even when things get difficult, it reminds me that I must have done something right as a father." I read those words over and over, trying to reconcile them with the legal document that had just erased me from his life. How do you go from being someone's anchor to being forgotten entirely? When did his pride in me transform into indifference? Or had the indifference always been there, hidden beneath polite words and obligatory birthday cards? I remembered other things too, moments that hadn't made it into letters. How I sat by his hospital bed during his recovery from the first stroke, helping him relearn simple words. How he gripped my hand so tightly during his physical therapy sessions, as if my presence was the only thing keeping him grounded. How he asked me, in a voice barely above a whisper, if I thought they would treat him right if he was gone. I had said yes then, though I wasn't entirely sure what he meant by they, or what treating him right would look like. I held his hand anyway and told him not to worry, that everything would be fine, that he was going to get better. But now I wondered if he had been trying to tell me something, if there was a warning hidden in that question that I had been too naive or too hopeful to understand. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of numbness and disbelief. I went to work, taught my classes, graded papers, attended faculty meetings, all while feeling like I was watching someone else live my life. My colleagues noticed something was off. I was quieter than usual, less engaged in departmental politics, more likely to eat lunch alone in my office than join the usual group in the faculty lounge. When people asked how I was doing, I gave them the standard responses. Fine, busy with end-of-semester grading, looking forward to summer break. I didn't know how to explain that I felt like I was grieving someone who was already dead, or that I was questioning everything I thought I knew about my place in the world. How do you tell people that your own family has decided you don't exist? A week later, something shifted inside me. I was sitting in my office, staring at the same essay I had been trying to grade for 20 minutes, when I realized I couldn't accept what had happened. Not because I wanted the money or the house or any of the physical things, but because something didn't feel right about the whole situation. My father had been methodical about everything in his life. His garden, his finances, his medical care. It seemed impossible that he would have simply forgotten about me, especially after all those years of letters and visits and shared moments. I began digging. I started with small things, inconsistencies that had nagged at me during the will reading. Why had they used a different law firm than the one my father had worked with for decades? When exactly had the will been changed? And who had initiated those changes? I requested copies of all the legal documents, not just the final will, but every version and amendment. The process was slow and bureaucratic, full of forms and waiting periods and fees I could barely afford on my teacher's salary, but I was determined to understand what had happened, to piece together the timeline of how I had disappeared from my father's plans. I called his old attorney, the one he had used before his remarriage, and was surprised when she agreed to meet with me. Margaret Chen had been practicing estate law for 30 years, and she remembered my father clearly. He was very specific about his wishes, she told me over coffee at a diner near her office. Very concerned about making sure you were taken care of. That's why we set up the trust structure the way we did, to protect your interests regardless of what happened with future relationships. Future relationships? I asked. Your father was pragmatic, she said gently. He loved your stepmother, but he also knew that blended families can be complicated. He wanted to make sure that his first obligation, to you, was protected, no matter what. She explained the original trust structure, how it had been designed with multiple safeguards to ensure that his primary beneficiary, me, could not be easily removed or disinherited. There were specific clauses requiring recorded approvals for any major changes, witnesses for amendments, and waiting periods before modifications could take effect. Based on what you're telling me, Margaret said, it sounds like someone has made changes that might not be legally valid. The trust was specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. I left that meeting with a growing sense of possibility, but also with a clearer understanding of just how deliberately I had been excluded. This wasn't an oversight or a moment of forgetfulness. Someone had worked very hard to remove me from my father's will, and they had done it in a way that suggested they knew exactly what obstacles they needed to overcome. I spent the next month following paper trails, requesting documents, and slowly piecing together a timeline of changes that had been made to my father's estate plan. What I discovered made my stomach turn. The most significant amendments had been made in the months following his major stroke, when his cognitive abilities were compromised, and his ability to understand complex legal documents was questionable, at best. I found signatures that looked shaky and uncertain, nothing like the careful, deliberate handwriting I remembered from his letters. I discovered pages that didn't align with earlier versions, clauses that contradicted the original trust, structure, and amendments that seemed designed specifically to circumvent the protections Margaret had built into his estate plan. But the most damning evidence was what I found buried deep in the original trust documents, a clause that I suspect the new lawyers had either missed or hoped no one would discover. It stated clearly that no amendment could override the designated living trust without my father's direct, recorded approval in the presence of his original attorney. It was a fail-safe Margaret had insisted on, a way to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation that appeared to have taken place. When I read that clause, sitting alone in my apartment surrounded by copies of legal documents, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not hope for money or property or any material thing, but hope that my father's true wishes could still be honored, that his love for me could be restored to its rightful place in his legacy. The next step was finding proof that this recorded approval had never taken place. I contacted Margaret again, and she helped me track down the original notary who had worked on my father's estate documents. Robert Martinez had been notarizing documents for 40 years, and he kept meticulous records of every transaction. When I explained what I was looking for, his expression grew serious. "I never notarized any amendments after your father's stroke," he told me, pulling out his detailed logbooks. "The last time I saw him was 6 months before his first medical episode, when we finalized some minor updates to his business arrangements. After that, nothing. If someone else notarized changes, to his trust, they would have had to use a different notary, and that alone should have been a red flag." Robert agreed to testify about his records, about the specific procedures my father had always followed, and about the conversation they had had during their last meeting. "Your father specifically asked me to make sure I understood the trust, protections," Robert remembered. "He said he wanted to be certain that no one could manipulate his wishes if he became unable to advocate for himself. He was very concerned about protecting your inheritance. Armed with this evidence, I knew I had to take legal action. But the thought of facing my stepfamily in court, of challenging their version of events publicly, filled me with anxiety. I wasn't naturally confrontational, and the idea of accusing them of manipulating a dying man felt enormous and terrifying. What if I was wrong? What if there was some explanation I hadn't considered? But then I thought about my father's voice, in those hospital rooms, the way he had gripped my hand when he was scared, the trust he had placed in me to advocate for him when he couldn't advocate for himself. If I didn't fight for his true wishes now, who would? If I let this manipulation stand, what did that say about the relationship we had shared? About the promises I had made to always be there for him? I hired an attorney who specialized in estate disputes. Linda Rodriguez listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who had seen family greed destroy relationships many times before. She reviewed my evidence methodically, asking detailed questions about timelines and witnesses, and documentation. When she finished, she looked up at me with something that might have been admiration. "This is a strong case," she said. "Very strong. Someone went to a lot of trouble to circumvent your father's original estate plan, but they made mistakes. The forged approvals, the change in legal representation, the timing of the amendments, it all points to a coordinated effort to defraud you of your rightful inheritance. The legal process moved slowly, as these things always do. There were depositions and document productions, interrogatories and motions, months of careful preparation before we ever stepped foot in a courtroom. During this time, my stepfamily's attitude toward me shifted from smugness to hostility. They stopped, pretending to be civil when we encountered each other in public. Sarah actually crossed the street once to avoid speaking to me. Michael sent me a long, angry email, accusing me of being greedy and disrespectful to our father's memory. My stepmother's response was perhaps the most telling. She called me one evening, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine emotion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Your father is gone. Can't we just honor his final wishes and move on? This legal battle is tearing the family apart." "His final wishes," I repeated quietly. "Are you sure these were actually his final wishes? Because the evidence suggests otherwise." There was a long pause. Then her voice hardened in a way that reminded me of all those years of being gradually excluded, all those moments when I had been made to feel unwelcome in my own family. "You always were too stubborn for your own good," she said, "just like your mother." It was the first time she had ever mentioned my mother with anything other than polite neutrality, and the venom in her voice told me everything I needed to know about the resentment that had been building for years. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. This was about erasing me completely, about rewriting the family history so that her children were the only ones who mattered. The day we went to court, I wore the same black dress I had worn to my father's funeral. It seemed appropriate somehow, like I was attending another kind of ending, another kind of goodbye. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, less dramatic than the legal proceedings you see on television. But the weight of what was happening felt enormous. My stepfamily sat on the other side of the room, dressed in their best clothes, looking like the picture of respectability. They had hired an expensive attorney who specialized in defending estate challenges, someone who probably dealt with cases like this regularly. But when I looked at their faces, I could see something that hadn't been there during the original will reading: uncertainty. Linda presented our case methodically, walking the judge through the timeline of amendments. The questionable signatures, the lack of proper approvals. She called Margaret Chen to testify about the original trust structure and my father's specific concerns about protecting my inheritance. She called Robert Martinez to testify about his records and his conversations with my father. But the most powerful moment came when Linda read aloud the clause that had been buried in the original trust documents. Her voice was clear and steady as she explained how this failsafe was specifically designed to prevent the kind of manipulation that had taken place. "Your Honor," she said, "this clause makes it clear that any amendment to the trust required recorded approval in the presence of the original attorney. We have found no evidence that such approval was ever given." The judge, an older woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes, listened to everything with careful attention. She asked pointed questions about the timeline, about the documentation, about the procedures that should have been followed. When my stepfamily's attorney tried to argue that the amendments were valid regardless of the technical requirements, she cut him off with a look that could have frozen water. "Counselor," she said, "these technical requirements exist for a very specific reason, to prevent exactly the kind of situation we're dealing with here. You can't simply ignore safeguards because they're inconvenient to your client's position." And when the judge read the crucial clause aloud for the record, something shifted in the courtroom. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with legal authority and moral weight. My stepmother had gone pale, her hands clutching her purse like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Sarah and Michael sat straighter, like children who had been caught in a lie they thought no adult would ever discover. Even Emma, who had seemed so confident during the original will reading, now looked young and uncertain. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The clause overrode everything that had come after. All the amendments made after my father's stroke were declared invalid. My name wasn't just added back to the will, it was reinstated to its original position as the primary beneficiary of the trust. The house on Maple Street, the investments, the life insurance policy, everything that had been distributed to my stepfamily was ordered to be returned to the estate and redistributed according to the original trust documents. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. For months I had imagined this moment, wondering how it would feel to be vindicated, to have my father's true wishes restored. But the reality was quieter than I had expected, more solemn than triumphant. This wasn't really a victory. It was a correction, a setting right of something that should never have been wrong in the first place. No one spoke to me after the ruling. Not in the courtroom, not in the hallway, not in the parking lot where we all stood for a moment in the afternoon sunlight, trying to process what had just happened. My stepfamily clustered together, whispering among themselves, casting glances in my direction that ranged from resentful to ashamed. I wanted to say something, to try to bridge the gap that had opened between us, but I realized there was nothing to bridge. The gap had always been there. The court ruling had simply made it visible. A few weeks later, I drove to the house on Maple Street to collect the keys from my stepmother. She answered the door wearing an old sweater and jeans, looking smaller, somehow, than she had in the courtroom. Her face was carefully neutral, but I could see the effort it was taking to maintain that composure. "The keys are on the kitchen counter," she said, without meeting my eyes. "I've removed our personal belongings, but everything else is as your father left it." I walked through the house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. The living room where we had watched movies during my high school years. The kitchen where my father had taught me to make his famous pancakes. The garden where we had worked side by side, planting flower beds and vegetable plots, talking about everything and nothing, while our hands worked in the soil. It was all exactly as I remembered, but it felt different now. Not because the space had changed, but because I understood my place in it differently. This wasn't just the house where my father had lived. It was the house he had wanted me to have. The legacy he had chosen to leave me. The proof that I had mattered to him even when others tried to convince me otherwise. In his study, I found things that my stepfamily had apparently overlooked or chosen not to disturb. Photo albums full of pictures of me and my father from throughout my childhood. Letters I had sent him from college, carefully preserved in a folder marked Julia. A journal where he had written about his hopes for my future, his pride in my accomplishments, his concerns about how the family dynamics were affecting our relationship. One entry, dated just a few months before his stroke, made me cry. I worry that I'm losing Julia, that the tension in the house is pushing her away. She's becoming more distant at family gatherings, and I don't blame her. I need to find a way to make sure she knows how much she means to me, regardless of what happens with the rest of the family. Maybe I should talk to Margaret about strengthening the trust protections. Reading those words, I realized that my father had been more aware of the family dynamics than I had given him credit for. He had seen what was happening, had recognized the subtle ways I was being excluded, and had tried to protect me in the only way he knew how. The trust structure, the legal safeguards, the careful documentation. It had all been his way of making sure I would be taken care of, even if he wasn't there to advocate for me himself. Standing in his garden a few days later, I whispered to the air around me, "You didn't forget me. They just hoped you did." The words felt right, like a conversation we should have had years ago, like a truth that needed to be spoken out loud. The flowers he had planted were still blooming, despite months of neglect. The tomato plants he had started from seeds were heavy with fruit. The herb garden we had designed together was thriving, filling the air with the scent of basil and rosemary and thyme. It was as if the garden itself was proof that his love for me had survived, had grown stronger even in his absence, had bloomed into something that no legal document could ever truly destroy. I knelt down and ran my hands through the soil, feeling connected to him in a way I hadn't felt since his death. This garden, this house, this legacy. It wasn't about money or property or winning some family competition. It was about being remembered, being chosen, being loved enough to be protected even when he couldn't be there to do the protecting himself. My stepfamily never spoke to me again. Not directly anyway. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they had moved away, started over in a different city where no one knew about the court case or the contested will. I heard that Sarah had gotten married and that Michael had started his own business. I heard that Emma had finished college and was doing well. I was glad for their successes, even though I knew I would never be part of their story again. The loneliness of that realization hit me sometimes, usually on holidays, or during moments when I wished I could share good news with family members who would understand its significance. But it was a clean kind of loneliness, honest and straightforward, very different from the confused hurt I had felt when I was trying to figure out why I didn't seem to belong in their version of family. I kept the house on Maple Street, not because I needed to live there, but because it felt important to preserve the space where my father had been happiest. I visited regularly, maintaining the garden, keeping the rooms clean and bright, making sure that his workshop stayed organized the way he had always liked it. Sometimes I brought friends there for dinner parties or holiday gatherings, filling the space with laughter and conversation, letting it serve the purpose he had always intended, bringing people together, creating memories, building the kind of family that chooses love over politics. On quiet evenings, I would sit in his favorite chair and read his journals, learning things about him I had never known, understanding the depth of his concern for my well-being, seeing the careful thought he had put into every decision that affected my future. I realized that the greatest gift he had left me wasn't the house or the money or any material thing. It was the knowledge that I had been truly loved, deeply valued, worth protecting. The court case had given me back my inheritance, but reading his private thoughts gave me back something more important: my confidence in our relationship, my certainty that I had mattered to him, my understanding that his love for me had been real and lasting and strong enough to survive beyond his death. Years later, when people asked me about the legal battle, I would tell them it wasn't really about winning or losing. It was about truth, about making sure that love gets the last word, even when greed and manipulation try to rewrite the story. It was about standing up for someone who could no longer stand up for themselves, about honoring promises and protecting legacies and refusing to let important relationships be erased by people who never understood their value in the first place. My father had promised to take care of me, and even from beyond the grave, he had kept that promise. Not because of money or property, but because he had loved me enough to build safeguards around that love, to create legal structures that would preserve his intentions even when others tried to circumvent them. He had anticipated the challenges I would face and had given me the tools to overcome them, trusting that I would be strong enough to fight for what was right when the time came. In the end, that trust turned out to be the most valuable inheritance of all. Not the knowledge that I could depend on his money, but the knowledge that I could depend on his love, that it was solid and reliable and permanent in ways that went far beyond legal documents or family politics. They had tried to delete my name from his story, but they had forgotten something important. I wasn't just a name on a list. I was his daughter, his anchor, his pride and joy. And that identity was written in places no lawyer could ever reach, preserved in ways no family manipulation could ever destroy.